He thought one simple question would expose an ordinary waitress, but before the night was over, it would expose everyone else instead. Richard Castellano had built his reputation on reading people faster than they could read themselves. Deals worth millions had turned on a single glance from his icy blue eyes, and powerful men twice his age had learned that the quiet moments frightened him more than angry ones. That Friday evening, however, he walked into Belamonte, the finest Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago, dressed like nothing more than another successful businessman looking for a late dinner. His tailored charcoal suit blended into the polished room filled with crystal glasses, warm amber lighting, and the soft melody of a piano drifting through conversations that sounded expensive. No one recognized him, at least that was what they believed. Richard preferred it that way. Respect offered freely meant very little. Respect revealed without fear was priceless. He took the corner table where he could watch the entire dining room without appearing to study anyone. Servers moved with practiced precision between polished walnut tables, while managers greeted familiar guests with polished smiles. Everything appeared flawless until his attention settled on a young waitress carrying a tray with effortless balance. Her name tag read Ava Brooks. Unlike the others, she never rushed. She never forced a smile that wasn't genuine. She acknowledged every guest with calm confidence, remembered orders without writing them down, and noticed details no one else seemed to catch. When an elderly couple quietly exchanged worried looks after checking the menu prices, she gently recommended two specials that happened to be the restaurant's best value, without making them feel embarrassed. When a little boy accidentally dropped his spoon, she replaced it before his mother even realized what had happened. Richard watched every movement without saying a word. Experience had taught him that character always revealed itself in the smallest decisions. Nearly an hour passed before Ava approached his table carrying a glass of sparkling water. "Good evening, sir," she said with a warm but measured smile. "Have you decided, or would you like another minute?" Richard looked up slowly, studying her face. There was no nervousness, no rehearsed enthusiasm, only quiet professionalism. Around them, conversations continued beneath the glow of antique chandeliers, but something about the moment caused his attention to sharpen. He closed the leather menu and folded his hands together. "Before I order," he said evenly, "I'd like to ask you one question." Ava nodded politely. "Of course, sir." Richard held her gaze for a long second before speaking. "If you had only one sentence to stop someone from making the biggest mistake of their life, what would you say?" For the first time that evening, silence seemed louder than the piano. A nearby server glanced over with a faint smile, clearly expecting an awkward exchange. Two businessmen at the next table paused their conversation, curious why anyone would ask such a strange question before ordering dinner. Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied Richard with the same quiet attention he had been giving her all evening. Then, without the slightest trace of panic, she asked one gentle question of her own. Would they still be willing to listen? Richard's expression changed almost too subtly for anyone else to notice. The test had begun, but somehow he already felt as though he was no longer the one asking the questions. Ava Brooks held Richard Castellano's gaze for another quiet second before offering the smallest smile, not because she believed she had impressed him, but because she genuinely wanted to understand the purpose behind his unusual question. Around them, the restaurant slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Glasses clinked softly, silverware brushed against porcelain plates, and conversations drifted beneath the warm glow of vintage chandeliers. Richard leaned back slightly, intrigued by the fact that she had answered his question with one of her own. Most people rushed to prove how clever they were. She had chosen to understand the person first. "Why would that matter?" he asked. Ava folded her hands neatly in front of her apron. "Because the right words mean very little if the other person has already decided not to hear them. Sometimes people do not need better advice. They need a reason to trust the voice giving it." Richard remained silent. Somewhere behind Ava, the restaurant manager watched nervously, wondering why one of his servers had been standing at a table for so long. Before he could interrupt, another customer quietly called Ava's name from across the room. She excused herself with calm professionalism, promised she would return in just a moment, and walked away without once looking back to see whether Richard approved of her answer. That interested him even more. She was not performing. She had already forgotten about impressing him because another guest needed assistance. Richard followed her with his eyes as she crossed the dining room. A businessman complained that his steak had arrived slightly cooler than expected. Ava apologized without blaming the kitchen, arranged for a replacement, and surprised the guest by bringing a complimentary bowl of soup while he waited. At another table, a little girl struggled to choose between two desserts. Instead of making the decision for her, Ava described both with such warmth that the child smiled before placing her order. None of these moments were dramatic. None would ever appear in a newspaper. Yet Richard knew that character rarely revealed itself during extraordinary situations. It revealed itself during ordinary ones repeated hundreds of times. A few minutes later, Ava returned carrying fresh bread and olive oil. "Have you decided on dinner, sir?" she asked. Richard closed the menu again. "Not yet." She tilted her head slightly, puzzled but patient. "May I ask another question?" he said. "You may ask anything." Her answer came without hesitation. "Why are you working here?" Richard asked. "You speak with confidence. You notice details other people miss. This does not seem like your final destination." Ava glanced around the elegant dining room before answering quietly. "No honest job should ever be considered too small. This restaurant happens to be where my life is today. It does not have to define where my life ends." Richard studied her carefully. There was no bitterness in her voice, no resentment, only quiet certainty. Most people measured success by titles or income. Ava measured it by integrity. Before Richard could respond, the manager finally approached their table wearing an apologetic smile. "I hope everything is all right, sir. Ava is one of our newest servers." Richard looked from the manager back to Ava. "Yes," he replied calmly. "I noticed. She is also the only person in this restaurant who has answered exactly what I needed to hear, even though she still has no idea what question I am really asking." Ava lowered her eyes for only a moment after Richard's unexpected compliment, then thanked him with the same quiet grace she had shown every customer that evening. The manager smiled politely, assuming the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, but Richard had no intention of letting the moment end. "Please bring me your recommendation," he said. "Not the restaurant's most expensive dish. The one you honestly believe is worth remembering." The manager looked relieved. At last, they were discussing food. Ava nodded thoughtfully instead of answering immediately. She glanced toward the kitchen, then back at Richard. "May I ask one more question before I recommend anything?" Richard folded his hands once again. "Go ahead. Are you looking for an impressive dinner?" she asked gently. "Or are you looking for an honest one?" The manager blinked in confusion. Richard smiled for the first time that evening, though it was almost impossible to notice unless someone had been studying him closely. "Explain." Ava spoke with calm confidence, never raising her voice. "The most expensive meal is designed to impress people sitting across the table. The most honest meal is the one a guest remembers months later because it made them feel welcome. Those are usually two very different choices." Richard noticed that several nearby diners had quietly stopped talking. Even the manager remained still, uncertain whether this unusual exchange was helping the restaurant or creating a problem. Ava never seemed aware of the audience gathering around her words. She continued as though she were simply answering a sincere question. "My grandmother used to tell me that people almost never come back because of the recipe. They come back because of how someone made them feel while serving it." Richard looked at the leather menu resting untouched beside his plate. During years of meetings in restaurants across New York, Chicago, and Boston, he had tasted meals prepared by award-winning chefs whose names appeared in magazines. Yet he struggled to remember most of them. Oddly enough, he could still remember a tiny neighborhood diner where an elderly waitress had once served him chicken soup during a snowstorm many years earlier. The food had been simple. The kindness had not. "Then what would you recommend?" he finally asked. Ava answered without hesitation. "The braised short ribs. They take nearly 8 hours to prepare. Most guests skip them because they are not the most expensive item on the menu, but every cook in our kitchen smiles when that order comes through because they know someone will taste the work instead of the price." Richard slowly closed the menu completely and handed it back to her. "Then that is what I will have." Ava thanked him and walked toward the kitchen, leaving behind another silence that lingered longer than any conversation. The manager watched her disappear through the swinging doors before quietly turning toward Richard. "She has only been here for 4 months, he admitted. "She surprises people almost every day." Richard's eyes remained fixed on the kitchen entrance. "No," he said softly. She does not surprise people. She simply reminds them of things they stopped noticing a long time ago. At that exact moment, hidden behind the kitchen door, Ava rested one hand lightly against the stainless steel counter and took a slow breath. She had answered every question honestly, yet something deep inside told her that the man sitting alone in the corner had not come for dinner at all. Whatever he was truly searching for had only just begun. A few minutes later, Ava emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming cast iron plate that filled the air with the rich aroma of slow-cooked herbs, roasted vegetables, and tender beef that had spent the better part of the day transforming through patience rather than speed. She placed the meal in front of Richard with careful precision, making certain every detail reflected the pride of the cooks who had prepared it. "I hope you enjoy it," she said sincerely. Richard thanked her, but instead of reaching for his fork, he looked at her once more. "You said people return because of how they feel," he began quietly. "Tell me something else. What is the hardest part of serving strangers every day?" Ava paused. It would have been easy to offer a polite answer about long hours or tired feet. Instead, she thought for several seconds before speaking. "The hardest part is remembering that everyone arrives carrying a story you cannot see." Richard listened without interrupting. Some guests celebrate promotions. Some are saying goodbye to someone they love. Some sit across from family members they have not spoken to in years. Others smile because they do not want anyone to notice they are lonely. "If I assume every table is just another order, I stop seeing people. When that happens, I am no longer serving meals. I am only moving plates." Richard slowly picked up his fork, but never looked away from her. The answer settled over the dining room more heavily than anyone expected. Even the bartender polishing glasses behind the counter found himself listening. "And how do you know which story someone is carrying?" Richard asked. Ava smiled gently. "I do not. That is exactly why I choose kindness first." Richard tasted the first bite of the braised short ribs. The flavors were rich, balanced, and comforting, but for once the food barely occupied his attention. Her words echoed louder than the piano drifting across the room. During his years leading companies and negotiating impossible agreements, he had met brilliant analysts, celebrated professors, and respected executives. Many possessed impressive knowledge. Very few possessed wisdom that could be applied in ordinary moments. Ava seemed to understand people without trying to control them. Before he could ask another question, an older gentleman entered the restaurant alone. His clothes were neat but worn with age. He hesitated near the entrance after glancing at the elegant dining room, clearly wondering whether he belonged there. The host greeted him politely, yet the uncertainty remained on the man's face. Ava noticed him immediately. She walked to the entrance before anyone else moved, welcomed him with the same warmth she had shown every other guest, and escorted him to a comfortable table near the window instead of placing him in a forgotten corner. She spoke to him with genuine respect, never once allowing him to feel out of place. Richard watched every second without saying a word. There was no audience for her kindness. She believed no one important was paying attention anymore. That, more than anything, convinced him it was real. As she returned toward his table, Richard quietly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card, placing it face down beside his untouched water glass. He had come to the restaurant believing he was evaluating one waitress. Now he was beginning to wonder whether fate had arranged the evening so that someone far wiser than he expected could quietly evaluate him instead. Richard left the business card untouched beside his glass as though he had forgotten it was there. But every decision he made was deliberate. He finished another bite of dinner while watching Ava continue through the evening with the same steady rhythm she had shown since he arrived. She moved from table to table without changing who she was for anyone. Wealthy guests received the same respectful attention as the elderly gentleman by the window. A young couple celebrating their anniversary received the same patient smile as a family trying to calm a restless child. Nothing about her seemed rehearsed. It was simply her nature. Nearly 20 minutes passed before she returned to refill his water. As she reached for the crystal pitcher, Richard spoke again. "Have you ever regretted choosing kindness?" Ava paused just long enough to consider the question honestly. "Yes," she answered. Richard raised an eyebrow. "More than once." He waited. "Some people mistake kindness for weakness," she continued. "Some believe that if you stay calm, you can be ignored. Others think respect has to be earned through status instead of character. Those moments can be discouraging." Richard nodded slowly. Then why keep doing it? Ava carefully set the pitcher back onto the service tray before answering. Because someone else's misunderstanding should never decide the kind of person I become. The words settled into the silence between them with remarkable weight. Richard had expected intelligence. He had expected thoughtful answers. What he had not expected was consistency. Every response came from the same quiet foundation, as though her values had been tested long before this evening. He looked toward the face-down business card, but made no move to reveal it. "Tell me something," he said. "If someone offered you a completely different life tomorrow, would you leave this place without looking back?" Ava smiled, though there was a trace of reflection behind it. "People often assume everyone wants to escape where they are. I only want to keep growing wherever I am needed. If a better opportunity comes with honest purpose, I will accept it. But I will never spend today pretending it has no value because tomorrow might be different." Richard leaned back, absorbing every word. Across the room, the elderly gentleman she had welcomed earlier quietly folded his napkin after finishing dinner. Ava noticed him reaching for the check before anyone else did. Instead of simply placing the receipt on the table, she thanked him for visiting and asked whether he had enjoyed the meal. His face brightened immediately. He admitted that it had been the first time he had eaten at a restaurant since losing his wife nearly a year earlier. He had almost turned around at the entrance because he thought dining alone would feel too difficult. Ava listened without interrupting, then wished him a peaceful evening and told him she hoped the next visit would come much sooner. The man left carrying nothing more than a small paper receipt, yet his shoulders seemed noticeably lighter than when he had arrived. Richard watched the front door close behind him and quietly realized that Ava had not merely served dinner. She had restored a little confidence to someone who needed it. Without another word, Richard turned over the business card resting beside his plate. Printed beneath his name was the title that almost no one in the restaurant would have expected to see. When Ava returned a few minutes later, her eyes fell naturally toward the card, and for the first time all evening, genuine surprise appeared on her face. Ava recognized the name on the card almost instantly, not because she followed headlines about influential business leaders, but because one of the restaurant's suppliers had once mentioned Richard Castellano while discussing a charitable education program his company quietly supported. She looked back at him with the same composed expression she had worn throughout the evening. "Thank you for trusting me enough to share your name," she said softly as she handed the card back with both hands. Richard noticed that she did not suddenly become nervous or overly eager to impress him. She did not ask for a favor, a photograph, or a business opportunity. She simply acknowledged the introduction with genuine courtesy. That response told him more than any conversation so far. "You already knew who I was?" he asked. Ava nodded slightly. "I recognized the name, not the face. I try not to assume anything about people before meeting them." Richard smiled faintly. "That is becoming a pattern with you." Ava answered with quiet honesty. "Assumptions are usually the shortest path to misunderstanding." Richard rested his elbows lightly on the table as the piano melody drifted through the dining room. "Then let me stop asking small questions." Ava remained standing calmly beside the table. "All right." Richard looked directly into her eyes. "Tomorrow morning, I am meeting two people who cannot agree on a decision that will affect hundreds of employees. They are both intelligent. They are both convinced they are right. If you had 1 minute before that meeting began, what would you tell them?" Ava did not rush to answer. Instead, she looked toward the large front windows where the lights of Chicago reflected across the glass. After several thoughtful seconds, she turned back to Richard. "I would ask them one question before offering any advice." Richard folded his hands together again. "Which question?" Ava answered in the same calm voice that had carried every conversation throughout the evening. "What result are you both hoping to protect?" Richard remained silent. She continued, "Most disagreements become impossible because people spend all their energy defending positions instead of protecting shared goals. Once people remember what they are trying to preserve together, solutions become easier to recognize." Richard slowly repeated her words to himself. Protect the shared goal. It sounded almost disarmingly simple, yet he realized how rarely experienced leaders actually began there. Around them, the restaurant continued serving dinner, unaware that a conversation about leadership was unfolding beside an untouched dessert menu. Richard looked down briefly before speaking again. "Who taught you to think that way?" Ava smiled, though there was a quiet sadness behind it. My father. Richard waited patiently. He worked as a community mediator for many years, she explained. Families, neighbors, small business owners, churches. Whenever people stopped listening to each other, they called him. He always said that every argument becomes louder the moment people forget what they both care about. Richard listened without interrupting. He also believed wisdom should never depend on a job title, Ava added. He used to tell me that the person carrying the coffee might notice the answer before the person leading the meeting. Richard looked around the elegant dining room once more. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath the warm lights while conversations floated peacefully through the room. Yet everything suddenly seemed different. He had entered Belamonte searching for exceptional judgment. Instead, he had discovered that genuine wisdom had been quietly carrying dinner plates all evening, waiting for someone willing to ask the right question. Richard remained seated long after the conversation should have ended, his untouched cup of coffee growing cooler as the sounds of Belamonte continued around him. For the first time in years, he found himself replaying someone else's words, instead of preparing his own. Protect the shared goal. The sentence was simple enough to fit on a single line, yet it carried the weight of lessons many executives never learned after decades in boardrooms. Ava noticed that he had drifted into quiet reflection and chose not to interrupt. She simply refilled his coffee before checking on the other guests. From across the dining room, Richard watched her move through another series of ordinary moments that no newspaper would ever report. She thanked the kitchen staff every time they handed her a plate. She remembered a regular customer's preference for unsweetened iced tea without asking. When a young server accidentally mixed up two orders, Ava corrected the mistake so naturally that neither table realized anything had happened. There was no desire for recognition in anything she did. She simply believed every small action deserved the same level of care. Richard finally stood and walked toward the front of the restaurant. The manager immediately greeted him with a polite smile, assuming he was ready to settle the bill. Instead, Richard asked a different question. How long has Ava worked here? The manager looked pleasantly surprised. Just over 4 months. Richard nodded. Has she always been like this? The manager laughed quietly. Every single day, customers ask for her by name now. New employees copy the way she speaks to people. She never complains, even during the busiest nights. Honestly, she has changed the atmosphere of this place more than anyone realizes. Richard looked across the room where Ava was helping an elderly woman carefully put on her light jacket before opening the restaurant door for her. There was no audience applauding the gesture. There was only gratitude reflected in the woman's smile. Does she know how much she influences people? Richard asked. The manager shook his head. I do not think she measures success that way. Those words confirmed everything Richard had begun to suspect. Influence built through humility lasted far longer than influence demanded through authority. A few minutes later, Ava returned to his table with the check folder. I hope your evening was enjoyable, she said warmly. Richard accepted the folder but did not open it. It was more valuable than I expected. Ava smiled politely, assuming he was complimenting the restaurant. Richard reached into his jacket once again and removed a small folded note. This time it was not a business card. He placed it beside the payment and gently slid it toward her. Please read this after your shift ends, he said. There is no rush. Ava looked at the envelope but made no attempt to open it. Thank you, she replied. I appreciate your trust. Richard nodded once before walking toward the entrance. Just before stepping outside, he paused and glanced back one final time. Ava was already helping another table, giving them the same thoughtful attention she had given him from the very beginning. She had not changed after learning who he was, and somehow that was the greatest answer she could have given. Richard stepped into the cool Chicago evening carrying the quiet certainty that tomorrow's meeting would begin very differently. Because the most important lesson he had learned that week had not come from an executive office. It had come from a woman who believed that every person deserved to be seen before they were ever judged. The next morning arrived with clear skies stretching above downtown Chicago as Richard Castellano entered the top-floor conference room where 2 senior executives had already taken their seats across a polished walnut table. Financial reports, market forecasts, and presentation folders covered nearly every inch of the surface, yet the atmosphere felt heavier than the documents themselves. Both leaders greeted Richard respectfully before immediately returning to defend their own positions. One insisted that rapid expansion was the only path forward. The other argued that protecting the company's culture mattered more than short-term growth. Their voices remained professional, but each sentence carried the quiet determination of people convinced that only one side could possibly be correct. Richard listened without interrupting. Nearly 15 minutes passed before he gently raised one hand. The room fell silent. Instead of opening the report prepared for the meeting, Richard remembered the calm voice of a waitress standing beside a restaurant table only hours earlier. He looked at both executives and asked a single question. What result are you both hoping to protect? Neither executive answered immediately. The question seemed almost too simple after weeks of preparation and countless pages of analysis. Richard waited patiently. Finally, one executive spoke. We want this company to remain strong for the people who depend on it. The other nodded slowly. And we want our employees to feel proud of working here for many years. Richard smiled quietly. Then you are not protecting different goals. You are protecting the same goal through different ideas. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. The discussion that followed sounded completely different from the argument that had filled the room minutes earlier. Instead of defending positions, both executives began searching for solutions that honored the purpose they had just acknowledged together. By the end of the meeting, they had designed a balanced plan that neither had considered before Richard asked that one question. As everyone gathered their papers, one executive paused beside Richard. Where did that question come from? He asked with genuine curiosity. Richard looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city before answering with a quiet smile. From someone who serves dinner better than most people serve advice. Later that evening, Richard returned to Belamonte without announcing his visit. The dinner rush had already begun, and Ava was once again moving through the dining room with the same calm confidence that had first captured his attention. Nothing about her had changed. She greeted families, remembered returning guests, thanked the kitchen staff, and quietly noticed details everyone else overlooked. When she finally reached his table, she smiled in pleasant surprise. Welcome back. Richard nodded warmly. Did you read the note? Ava answered with quiet gratitude. I did. Inside the envelope had been only one handwritten sentence. Thank you for reminding me that wisdom often wears an ordinary uniform. Ava had folded the note carefully and placed it inside the small notebook she carried every day because she believed meaningful words deserved to be remembered. Richard looked around the restaurant before speaking again. You helped solve a problem today without ever leaving this building. Ava looked genuinely puzzled. I did. Richard nodded. The question you gave me changed an entire meeting. Ava lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at him with the same humility she had shown from the beginning. Then I am glad the question found the right place to be asked. Richard smiled, realizing that even now she accepted no credit for something that would have made many people eager for recognition. And in that quiet moment, he understood that true influence always belongs to those who seek to serve before they seek to be noticed. Over the following weeks, Belamonte looked exactly as it always had. The piano still played softly beneath the amber lights. The scent of fresh bread and herbs still welcomed every guest who stepped through the front door. Ava Brooks still arrived early, tied on the same apron, greeted the kitchen staff by name, and served every table with the same quiet care that had defined her from the very beginning. Nothing about her appearance suggested that anything had changed, yet everything around her had. The manager noticed that employees had become more patient with one another. New servers naturally adopted her habit of listening before speaking. Returning guests often requested her section, not because she promised perfection, but because she made every person feel that their presence mattered. One afternoon, the manager called Ava into his office. Expecting a routine schedule update, she instead found Richard Castellano waiting beside the window. He stood as she entered and offered a warm smile. I wanted to thank you in person one last time, he said. Ava looked genuinely surprised. You already did. Richard shook his head gently. Not completely. He placed a small envelope on the desk. This is not a reward. It is not a payment for advice. Think of it as an investment in someone who reminds people what leadership looks like. Ava opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter offering full financial support for a professional leadership and conflict resolution program through one of his company's educational foundations, with no obligation to work for his organization afterward. She looked up slowly. You would help me even if I never become your employee? Richard answered without hesitation. Especially then. Wisdom should never be purchased. It should be encouraged wherever it already exists. For a long moment, Ava said nothing. Then she folded the letter with the same care she had given his handwritten note days earlier. My father used to tell me that when someone opens a door for you, the best way to thank them is to hold the next door open for someone else. Richard nodded with quiet admiration. Then I believe your father understood leadership better than many people who spend their lives studying it. As Richard prepared to leave, the restaurant staff gathered near the entrance after hearing that an important visitor had stopped by. Instead of making a speech, Richard looked around the room and spoke only one sentence. Never measure the value of a person by the name printed on a name tag. The room became completely still. Several employees lowered their eyes, remembering moments when they had underestimated others without realizing it. Richard thanked the staff, shook the manager's hand, and walked out into the afternoon sunlight. Ava returned to the dining room only minutes later, carrying a tray exactly as she had on the night they first met. A family smiled as she approached their table. An elderly couple thanked her for remembering their favorite booth. A little boy proudly showed her the drawing he had made while waiting for lunch. She welcomed each moment with the same quiet grace, never asking to be admired, never expecting recognition, and never forgetting that every person carried a story invisible to everyone else. Richard drove away knowing he had entered the restaurant believing that influence belonged to those with titles, wealth, and authority. He left understanding that the strongest voices are often the calmest ones. The greatest teachers are not always standing at the front of the room, and the deepest wisdom can sometimes be found carrying a dinner tray with quiet dignity. And on that ordinary day, everyone who crossed Ava Brooks's path remembered what true respect looked like.